Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Lawrence Cantor, the Chief Curator here at the Yale Art Gallery. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all today and to introduce John Walsh. The easiest job any curator could ask for is introducing John Walsh. Yale graduate from the class of 1961, Director Emeritus of the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles, renowned specialist in the study of Dutch paintings, Art Gallery governing board member, and above all, great friend to all of us here at the Art Gallery. He begins today his new lecture series, Rembrandt Today, inspired by the generous loan to the gallery of Rembrandt's incomparable portrait of Eltje Ellenbourg. Rosemary, thank you so much. Ellenbourg, from the collection of Rosemary and Ike van Otterlo. John will lead us through a rapid but penetrating tour of Rembrandt's career over the course of 6 lectures, all generously sponsored by the Martin Ryerson Lecture Fund. As is John's way, each lecture will begin with a single picture, focusing closely on that object before stepping back to look at the wider context in which it was made. In the lectures that follow, John will examine works in the collections of the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, the Frick Collection in New York, the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, as well as etchings in the gallery's collection, and of course, Eltje Eulenburg. John, you're going to have the easiest time in the world following this. We are especially grateful to Rosemary and Ike van Otterlo, whose collection of 17th century Dutch paintings and the generosity with which they share that collection are rapidly becoming legendary. They are the inspiration for this series. We are also grateful, of course, to John Walsh. In addition to the lectures he offers in this hall, John works tirelessly with Jessica Sack in our Wordle Gallery teacher program, teaching graduate students from a variety of disciplines across campus to slow down, look closely, and take the time to find out what can be learned from works of art. If you have not done so already, please pick up a Rembrandt Today gallery card on your way out for a complete list of all the lectures in this series. Now may I ask you to turn off your cell phones and join me in welcoming John Walsh, introducing you to Rembrandt's debut in Amsterdam.
Thank you. Larry, thank you very much. Rembrandt was the dominant artist in the Dutch culture that I studied as a graduate student 50 years ago. It seemed to me that my teachers more or less agreed on what made Rembrandt important. His skills, his knowledge, his goodness, his candor, his independence from fashion. In fact, the Dutch people I knew recognized Rembrandt as one of them. They saw their own national virtues embodied in him, their own best selves. Since the 19th century, Rembrandt had become a moral hero for them and for many other people as well. Well, in 50 years' time, the picture of Rembrandt has changed. We know more today about his business, his patrons, the web of his connections among people in his circle. We know more about his ambitions, about his teaching, about the diaspora of his pupils, many pupils, and his sources of inspiration. We recognize that his dealings with other people, personal and commercial, didn't always have the generosity of spirit that he'd been credited with. His huge output of drawings and etchings has been restudied, and for most of those 50 years, the Rembrandt Research Committee examined every painting and tried to identify what he did and didn't paint. The result was a corpus of the paintings that runs to 6 volumes and about 60 pounds. The number of pictures attributed to Rembrandt in the catalog that I'd used as a student was cut roughly in half, And then in the past dozen years, including the last topmost volume of the corpus, dozens and dozens of paintings that had been rejected or placed under suspicion were reinstated. And quite a few previously unknown paintings by Rembrandt have come to light. For these lectures, I've chosen topics that have interested me at different times during these years, some of them tied up with my experiences of studying Rembrandt, and even, I'm lucky enough to say, acquiring works by him. We'll re-examine Rembrandt and how things stand with him today. We'll look at what's been learned about the artist, what's been claimed and refuted by dozens of academics and curators. And we'll encourage you, as Larry said, when you go to museums, to look at pictures slowly and up close so that you make the guards nervous. Today we look at the launch of Rembrandt's career as the most accomplished painter in Amsterdam. When he got there at the age of 26, he'd already spent almost 10 years training and painting professionally in his hometown of Leiden, but he'd never had a commission for a portrait. The picture on the screen gives an idea of how talented he was and how he seized the opportunity when it arose for him in Amsterdam. And let's just look at it for a few minutes. I'll show you some details, things you can see for yourself upstairs in the galleries, thanks to the wonderfully generous people who have lent it. I'm not going to comment on these images. I'm just going to look with you. Well, it may have struck you at first how exact the whole thing is, how carefully detailed her costume and her features are. Now here's where coming close pays off. You realize that what appears from a distance to be in sharp focus is not so sharp. For example, the furrows of her forehead and the corners of her eyes are strokes of gray that you can actually see. The lighter parts of her face have a kind of pebbly texture. The highlights on her nose are thicker touches of white. And the more you look, the more active the surface becomes. Look at her jawline, for instance. The light bounces up off of her collar onto her skin, and it gives it a sheen like pewter. That white cap she wears could have cost Rembrandt a lot of labor, but you see, it's quite freely laid on with detached strokes of white and gray. Her fur trim is suggested by brown blotches put on with a very soft brush and then just flicked up onto the background. To appreciate the difference between Rembrandt and the competition, here's the head of a somewhat younger woman on the left by the very competent Nicholas Elias. Similar pose, costume, color range, and a pleasant but sober expression. But look at the cheeks and the foreheads. One smooth with a bit of gloss, the other with a distinct texture produced by a buildup of paint that's not been smoothed over. And look again at the shadow on the cheek and jaw. Both are invaded by light, reflected up from the rough, One is uniform, and the other seems to shimmer. So Rembrandt's advantage was that he delivered all the clarity that people were accustomed to paying for, plus a lot of subtle virtuosity to linger over and admire and point out to your friends. This is not the more familiar Rembrandt of the late years, the painter of Margarethe de Geer, almost 30 years later, with its tremendous directness and somber setting and thickly applied paint, and the sense of a message intended for us spectators about mortality and dignity. This is the young Rembrandt, a painter of refined delicacy. But I think at the same time there's strength in Altje Uilenburg, in the level candor of the way she looks at us. Rembrandt paints a kind of aureole of light around her, making the background darken above her, and this adds a subtle sense of drama and importance to her portrait, modest as it is. She was the 62-year-old wife of an Orthodox Calvinist minister in Amsterdam, Jan Cornelis Sylvius, the man in Rembrandt's etched portrait. In her position, she would have been expected to dress conservatively, without ostentation, and she has. Normally, Rembrandt would have been asked to paint Sylvius, too, and we'd have a pair of matching oval portraits, which is a shape of portrait that was popular, a kind of novelty in Amsterdam in these years. Well, if he did paint them, we've lost Anslow's portrait. Just to show you what such a pair might have looked like, here's a substitute from the Metropolitan on the left. Same size, same shape, same date. Rembrandt knew Altje Uilenburg. She was the niece of Hendrik Uilenburg, a well-connected art dealer to whom Rembrandt lent 1,000 guilders in these days. He had the money already, and with whom Rembrandt formed a business partnership. Altje had a 21-year-old cousin named Saskia Uilenburg, and in the following year, Rembrandt was engaged to her. This delicate silver point drawing records their betrothal and Saskia's birthday. The next year, they were married. This was evidently a love match and certainly a good career move. Rembrandt married into a large and well-to-do family that gave him access to a clientele that was linked together by their merchant status and often their religious affiliations. This wasn't the uppermost crust of Amsterdam society, but these were people with money, usually fairly recently gotten, and with social ambition. Many of them lived near one another in Uilenburg's neighborhood, which was recently built up with fine houses. The city was expanding outward from its medieval core with the Dam Square and the new church in the center. Uilenburg lived up here in a neighborhood, mixed neighborhood, you'd say, that was becoming a magnet for artists and artisans. Running through that neighborhood was Broadway, the Breestraat. Was renamed a century later the Jodenbreestraat after the well-known, well-to-do Jewish population that lived and worked there. At the end of it is the Zuiderkerk. Where am I looking here? And further along, at the lower right, the weighing house that was soon going to get a large painting by Rembrandt. Uilenburg was a dealer in paintings. He handled older art and was also an agent for contemporary artists, a kind of go-between and business getter for contemporary artists. And there was a studio in his house. Rembrandt became a boarder in the house and the head of the studio. Uilenburg put him in that position because Rembrandt's work in Leiden during the previous 4 years had gotten him some notice, especially his small history paintings. And in fact, several of them had been bought for the court of the stadtholder in The Hague, Prince Frederick Hendrik, you see at the left, such as this small scene of Pluto abducting a very unwilling Proserpina and plunging down into the underworld with her in his chariot. The action is lively, the craftsmanship brilliant, and the surfaces jewel-like. Rembrandt was 25. How did he get so fast, so far, so fast? Let me flash back for a few minutes to his years in Leiden. That city was the second largest to Amsterdam, but much smaller. His father was a miller. You can see his grain mill there at the lower left. And right on the Rhine, which cuts through the city. Milling was lucrative and respectable, and his father had married above his station, so Rembrandt got to go to the Latin school through his high school years. That's it, by the way, on the left. You can go and look at the building, although the school has moved on, and there's a computer software company in there now. There he studied classical and modern literature, the Bible, and history. At 14, he registered in the Leiden University, but never attended at all. Instead, he studied drawing and painting with Isaac van Swanenburg, a Leiden artist who'd worked for many years in Italy, and he'd learned enough after a few years, Rembrandt did, to go to work in Amsterdam under Peter Lasman. Now, Lasman was the perfect teacher if you wanted to be a history painter. He'd also worked in Italy, and he'd observed the revolutionary changes in Venetian and Roman painting in the early 17th century. And Lasman got very good at composition, what the Dutch call ordonnantie, clear, legible arrangements of figures, which you can see in small paintings like this one, a scene from a play by Aeschylus in which two close friends here are arguing about which of them is going to get to be sacrificed for the sake of the other. Lasman had made a market for himself for high-minded subjects from the Bible or classical writers, and he showed Rembrandt how to give his figures solid, believable physiques and poses, clear gestures, vivid expressions, and also how to use classical-looking props and costumes in the background. Lasman paints this scene in 1625, probably while Rembrandt is still in the studio. It shows the general Coriolanus during a siege being begged for mercy by his own mother and wife and other women. Rembrandt adapted the composition for one of his own, which is set also in classical antiquity. But what scene it represents is still a mystery. Recently, a costume historian pointed out that there's a big difference in what the two main figures are wearing here. Coriolanus by Lasman has credible Roman gear on, but Rembrandt's man wears a fur-lined tunic and leggings, a kind of imaginary outfit with sort of barbarian associations. That puzzle remains. Like Lasman, Rembrandt worked on small panels and pretty quickly learned how to use a subtler range of colors. He gave his actors a whole repertory of exaggerated expressions. In the scene on the right of Christ driving the money changers out of the temple, the emotions are anger, fear, and pain. In the case of old Tobit at the left, the impoverished, pious, blind Tobit, the situation calls for pathos. His wife, Anna, has brought back a goat from the market, and Tobit is convinced that she must have stolen it. He's in despair. She's astonished. This is a trivial incident in a long, rich story, but it is a test of the power of pose and expression. Facial expression was Rembrandt's closest study in these years. He looked in the mirror and recorded his own face over and over and over. He studied himself, in fact, with more persistence and fascination than any artist ever had. The main purpose seems to have been to build his skills at expressing emotion. Certainly there's some play acting, too, a trying out of aspects of himself. We'll discuss that in a later lecture on self-portraits. In the upper left, though, it's a shock to see him giving his own features to a miserable-looking beggar. At the lower right, he's a soldier wearing neck armor like the gear that the militiamen wear in the night watch. Rembrandt had a close colleague in Leiden for a couple of years, Jan Lievens, who was talented and had what appears to have been also a working partnership with Rembrandt. Lievens also painted his own face many times, and at the top, he painted his friend Rembrandt too. It's hard to tell the unsigned paintings of one artist from another. This is a large panel on the right that shows the Israelite heroine Esther revealing to the king the treachery of his trusted minister Haman. You can see him on the left. For a long time, the picture was attributed to Rembrandt, then to a combination of Rembrandt and Lievens, and now the consensus is Lievens. Lievens alone painted it. Sorry. Rembrandt's power of expression impressed Constantijn Huygens, who was the private secretary to the Prince of Orange, a man who was a learned connoisseur and something of a talent spotter. Huygens was the first person to write about Rembrandt's abilities. In his diary about 1629 or 30, he mentions two young artists in Leiden who were barely 3 years into their careers. He writes this: Rembrandt surpasses Lievens in his sure touch and in the liveliness of emotions. Conversely, Lievens is superior in invention and in a certain grandeur of his daring themes and forms. Huygens was especially smitten by Rembrandt's painting of the repentant Judas, which I'm sure some of you went to New York to see this summer in the Morgan Library's show about it called Rembrandt's First Masterpiece. Huygens wrote this about the picture. The singular gesture of the despairing Judas, that one furious, howling Judas, praying for mercy, but devoid of hope, all traces of hope erased from his countenance, his appearance frightening, his hair torn, his garments rent, his limbs twisted, his hands clenched bloodlessly tight, fallen prostrate on his knees on a blind impulse, his whole body contorted in wretched hideousness. I place this against all the elegance that has been produced throughout the ages. And Huygens goes on to say that he's amazed that, what he says, a youth, a Dutchman, a bearded miller could bring together so much in one human figure and express it all. Rembrandt, for Huygens, had the faculty of penetrating to the heart of his subject and bringing out its essence. Huygens put his finger on qualities that were going to distinguish Rembrandt for 40 more years, particularly that skill at finding the emotional and moral center of gravity in a story and expressing it. Rembrandt got more and more ambitious in his last years at Leiden, especially as a painter of narrative scenes of myth and scripture. This painting in Boston shows a solitary artist, maybe Rembrandt himself, facing a huge panel, like David sizing up Goliath. We can't see what he's painting. He makes it an image of an idealized confrontation of youth and the great unknown, the task ahead. A year or so later, Rembrandt got a commission to paint a portrait of Amalia van Solms, the wife of the stadtholder, Frederick of Orange, Prince Frederick, who was the chief executive, you could say, and chief commander-in-chief of the Dutch Republic. Rembrandt must have spent some months in The Hague. You see the prince here wearing red, and gotten a taste of life at court, which was insular, French-speaking, and small potatoes compared to the commercial metropolis of Amsterdam. It was evidently, this picture, to be a companion piece to her husband's portrait by Gerard van Honthorst, in profile, like the emperors and empresses on Roman coins, and not exactly a format for peering into people's souls. He painted at least one other person living in The Hague, a wine merchant, an officer in the militia company, Joris de Cholerae, who had Rembrandt present him as every inch the military officer and not one bit the wine merchant. He's wearing the buff coat of a soldier, holding a caliver, which is a kind of musket, hand on hip in his gesture of command, with gleaming armor and a confident gaze, light behind him, creating, again, a kind of force field even stronger than the ones you saw around Altje Uilenburg. He introduces a theatrical trick here, the inexplicable shadow that falls on him, so that his face and upper body get extra emphasis. Rembrandt had painted the first great life-size portrait of this type in Amsterdam the year before, a picture that I imagine you all know in the Frick collection. We have to imagine that it was Uilenburg who got this commission for Rembrandt, his protege. This man, Nicholas Rutz, was a merchant whose business included trade with Russia, which probably accounts for the fur hat on his head and the unusually conspicuous fur trim of his overgarment, called a tabard, which was worn by academics and clergymen and other people of distinction, or who wanted to claim distinction. Rembrandt shows him turning toward us and holding out a slip of paper, making the point that he's a man of affairs. His forehead is a bit contracted as he gives his whole attention to the spectator. The face is patiently finished, but everywhere there are signs of the painter's energy. The flicks of his wide brush that make the fur, the gouges with the butt of the brush that make the wiry hairs in his mustache. The whole effect is of mental and physical forcefulness, subdued for long enough to make a likeness. This is another portrait of 1631, Rembrandt's first year in Amsterdam. We don't know who the man on the left was. He's painted as though he'd been caught writing, interrupted, head turned, mouth open to speak. Well, you might ask, where did Rembrandt get the idea of animating a portrait in this way? Probably from group portraits like this one by Nicolas Elias, who had been the leading portrait painter in Amsterdam until Rembrandt arrived. It's a group of trustees pictured as responsible citizens. The man at the left, as you'll see with the book, is interrupted and looks up and out at us. Rembrandt takes that formula and gives it something extra. He gives it a vibrancy and a mystery through the light in the room and an even more momentary feeling to the action. A portrait of just a bit later shows the Amsterdam merchant Martin Loten with what looks like a letter with his name on it and the date, January 11th, 1632, and a lot of pretend writing. The idea of the picture is one we've seen already, a man taking a moment from his busy, profitable life to look at us and do that for posterity, for all to see and remember him by. Loten sat for his portrait in Rembrandt's place of business, the studio in the house of Uilenburg, his dealer and agent and soon-to-be father-in-law. To please his clients, Rembrandt, first of all, had to meet the expectations that other portrait painters like Piquenoy had established. The picture had to resemble the person, naturally, and also convey his or her status in the world. And so much the better if the artist could give the spectator a sense of being in the actual presence of the client, to give him the illusion of life. So Loten contracts his forehead a bit, parts his lips as though to speak. He also used lighting and pose and props to make the man a person of importance and the woman a person of virtue and sympathy. Well, here's an example of what an Amsterdam client might expect of a portrait painter just a few years before Rembrandt arrived. On the left, this is Paulus Moreelse, painting a well-born man dressed in extremely expensive clothes with a meticulous technique, giving him, as you can see, sort of conventional pose, bland expression, and very little animation in the face. When he wasn't doing portraits, Rembrandt continued to paint historical subjects on a small scale, the kind that Constantijn Huygens and evidently the Prince of Orange favored. The prince had bought the picture on the right a few years earlier, perhaps after his scout Huygens saw it in Rembrandt's studio in Leiden. Rembrandt returned to this subject and did another version, very different, doing away with the intimacy close up and instead drawing back to present a scene that's breathtaking in its theatrical setting and lighting. He invents a vast temple that's a dizzy kind of Semitic Gothic fantasy, swarming with tiny figures. A beam of light comes from some offstage source and picks out the old rabbi and the Holy Family. The light becomes the messenger of divine revelation to the Jews, who aren't, it must be said, paying much attention. Simeon's robe shimmers and seems translucent. It may, in fact, have been one of Rembrandt's purchases around this time, since he was an avid buyer of costumes and exotic props of all kinds, which he used for biblical and historical scenes like this, and also for single figures. For example, this one at the Met, which is best known, I think, of all these figures. They weren't commissioned portraits or mere costume pieces. They were also exercises in pose and expression, and also in various kinds of lighting and techniques of painting, rich fabric and metalwork, arms and armor, and so on. They also served his pupils, who made copies or variations of Rembrandt's style, of studies like this, and used them for entire compositions sometimes. They belong to a category that the Dutch called tronie, a single figure in exotic or military outfit with no specific historical identity. There are a great many tronies by Rembrandt and his pupils mentioned in 17th century archives. Rembrandt used this particular male model on the right half here, half a dozen times, including for this one, an imaginary portrait of St. Peter, to judge from the keys that he's clutching. What sets this Peter apart is the intensity of his expression. He's clearly troubled. The core of Peter's story is his repentance after he betrayed Christ, which accounts for his expression, which is all the more striking when you compare it, for example, to the other great painter of tronies and saints, his older contemporary in Antwerp, Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens's Peter, by comparison, is robed in white, like the Pope that he was, the first pontiff of the Church, and he attends entirely to God, not to us fellow humans. His picture is about sanctity and authority. Rembrandt's is about guilt. Peter focuses his guilty and disturbed mind on the viewer, as if he were asking for our understanding. 30 years later, Rembrandt painted a series of apostles in the same format, but now in his most thickly built-up style of painting, with broad strokes of the brush. This St. Bartholomew holds the instrument of his martyrdom, the knife that was used to skin him alive, and his pensive state of mind is something fascinating, but that we can't fathom, only guess at. Rembrandt kept on with small-figured history paintings during the 1630s. This one is hardly more than 2 feet wide. It's the picture I have the greatest feeling for, I think, because when I worked at the Metropolitan Museum, I was very conscious that we had no early narrative paintings by Rembrandt, and this was the best one in private hands anywhere. I wanted, in the worst possible way, for the owner to lend it to us, but he was an elderly, disagreeable Swiss who wouldn't talk to me. My successor, Walter Liedtke, managed to pry it away, and in the early 1990s, you could see it at the Met, as many of you did probably, covered with yellow varnish, as it is here in the picture, but in wonderful condition. Meanwhile, I'd moved on to a museum that needed the picture even more, and eventually we got it. And after a judicious cleaning, the painting looked the way Rembrandt intended it to. The story is from Ovid. It's how Europe got its name. The Princess Europa of Tyre in modern Lebanon encountered an attractive white bull in a nearby meadow, who was, of course, Jupiter in disguise, who was so sweet that he invited her to get up on his back for a ride, which she did. And the ride proved longer than she had expected, despite her protests all the way to the island of Crete, rather. And there, with Jupiter's help, she had a great many important children. Rembrandt imagines her handmaidens theatrically distraught, and a Moorish driver there at the top in an astonishing golden wagon, which would have looked at home parked outside Rembrandt's Temple of Jerusalem. It is supposed to be happening on the Mediterranean Sea, but this is more like a Dutch river with a fortified town of fantasized antiquity. Rembrandt pulls off some feats of illusion here, like the calm water with its colorful and woozy reflections of the bull and his passenger. And there are delightful details, like Europa's expression of amazed disbelief, her tight grip on his hide and his horn, and the bull's eager gaze towards the future with his tail erect with excitement. I mean, it's a sure thing that some paintings like this were commissioned, but we rarely know which ones. We assume, though, that Eilenberg's house, at that house, portrait sitters and visitors could come and look at other pictures by Rembrandt on display and buy them. For example, such biblical subjects as this one, the raising of Lazarus on a 3-foot-high panel. Rembrandt imagines Christ as a kind of magician in a cavern hung with swords and armor. He stands high above the tomb with his arm raised and his mouth open. Lazarus seems insensate, but he sits up, obedient to the command. Rembrandt creates a mysterious place that's lighted from this side, from offstage, you could say, and populates it with actors who use body language and expressions to multiply the reactions one might have to a grotesque and impossible and joyous surprise. Rembrandt set out to reproduce this picture in a large etching. Not just reproduce it, but to rethink it. He turned the cave, you see, to face outdoors, so it admits a bigger splash of light. At both edges, he makes the spectator's reactions even more attention-getting and makes Christ even more impossibly tall. We'll come back to this print, which is 2 feet high and terrifically ambitious. It marks Rembrandt's turn towards attracting a wider audience for his art. At this point, Rembrandt was doing well. He was getting ahead in the lucrative portrait practice. He was painting history paintings with small figures in the meticulous style he'd perfected in Leiden, and he was getting serious about etching. His great leap forward came when he got a commission, probably through Eilenberg again, from a prominent physician called Dr. Nicholas Tulp, a celebrated surgeon and anatomist who wanted a portrait of a group of colleagues, with Tulp himself shown as their teacher. It was intended for this building, the headquarters, well, the upstairs rooms were the headquarters of the Surgeons' Guild in the St. Antoniswaag, a medieval gatehouse converted to a weighing house. It's 5 minutes' walk from Eilenberg's house. This wouldn't be the first time that a teacher of anatomy had been portrayed in a dissection. These anatomical demonstrations were public events. Teachers performed them in anatomical theaters, a small theater in the round where they dissected corpses of recently executed criminals in front of spectators. Here in Mierenfeld's picture, the doctors surround Dr. van der Meer as he proceeds in the sequence prescribed by Vesalius in his book on human anatomy 70 years before. He proceeds by opening the abdominal cavity first. Rembrandt took this dull yearbook picture formula for a group portrait and turned it into something thrilling. I mean, here we're not in an anatomical theater, but instead some kind of shadowy, vaulted building, more like Lazarus's cave. And Tulp is not dissecting in the prescribed way at all. He's opened up the arm so that others can see how the arm and the hand work, how the tendons make the fingers move. It's a demonstration of the intricate, ingenious machinery of the body, mastered by Vesalius, who I have to say was from the Netherlands. He was baptized Andries van Wezel and then Latinized himself to Vesalius, who was certainly the author of the big book on the right, propped up on. Dr. Tulp's calling in life is to expound this knowledge to his followers. And they react with expressions of surprise, of excitement, doubt, wonderment, each expression different and vivid. Calm, on the other hand, is Tulp. Tulp is utterly calm and speaking. To well-dressed, well-educated people looking at the picture, Vesalius must have been present in their minds. They would have seen this portrait on the left in his great treatise, and perhaps remember what he chose to be pictured doing, showing how the arm and hand work, doing what Tulp is doing. Tulp certainly knew the picture, and he had Rembrandt paint a demonstration of his own mastery of that knowledge. By extension, human mastery of nature. And more than that, a demonstration of Tulp as inheritor and transmitter of that mastery. Rembrandt's portrait practice surged in the following years. Some of his clients belonged to the clergy. In Eilenberg's circle, liberal Calvinists, Mennonites, and Remonstrants. The most famous and important of all of these was this 76-year-old man, Johannes Artebogaert, a preacher who had been tutor to the Prince of Orange, a hero to moderates during the sectarian struggles during Rembrandt's youth, and now returned from self-imposed exile. Rembrandt gives him a familiar gesture of heartfelt conviction, hand on breast, and the details of the heavy lines on his face that seem to be the record of his spiritual struggles. Now, documents shed some interesting light on how Rembrandt worked. Artebogaert noted in his diary that he only sat for Rembrandt for one day, and that probably was not enough time for him to sketch the whole composition and paint in the face. Since the hands in the portrait are relatively crude, the assumption has been recently that he had help from assistants for those hands, and that's certainly true with a good many of Rembrandt's portraits. One pupil of Rembrandt's noted, in addition, that Rembrandt made a practice of having his portrait's subjects bring with them a collar or a ruff and leave them behind in the studio after they're sitting, which helps to solve the puzzle of how he managed to paint something as intricate, difficult, subtle to paint as this man's collar in the short day he had. In another category altogether are the marriage portraits of Martin Solmans and Opien Koppet. Last year, the Rijksmuseum and the Louvre bought these jointly from the Paris Rothschilds. They were she was from a rich and socially prominent family, marrying for the second time. She steps toward her proud betrothed, who shows the glove that he'd accepted from her father, which was a conventional symbol for the groom's acceptance of authority over the woman he's marrying. Sorry, but that's how it was. Getting painted life-sized and full-length had been the prerogative of high-born people, but in Rembrandt's time things were changing, and some merely wealthy people had begun to commission full lengths and find the wall space that could hold them, or build the wall space. This man was a cloth dealer in Haarlem called Willem van Heethuizen, who had Frans Hals give him the full treatment, including sword, cloth of honor over his head, Renaissance garden behind, and so forth. These were social climbers, there were everywhere, but not many had the cheek to present themselves quite as grandly as this man, in full length yet. The couple is dressed in spectacularly expensive and showy outfits, and by their actions they get the message across, not so much to do with personality or mutual attraction, but everything to do with their family alliance and their standing in the world. Other sitters wanted other things from Rembrandt, including some movement, even excitement. This young woman at the Met turns in her chair to look at us. Now, over the years, her portrait was separated from her husband's, so we've lost the fullness of Rembrandt's invention here, which was to have the man lunge forward, rising out of his chair, gesturing to her, as she turns away, as though in modesty. Rembrandt sticks to the convention of having each of them look at the spectators, which limits what they can express for each other. I think I was the first one to bring these portraits back together, but only temporarily, in a show of Dutch pair portraits at the Met in 1970. I had matching frames made for them, and which they still wear whenever they have conjugal visits, as they were having at the Met 2 years ago when I took the cell phone picture. Her portrait is both more beautifully painted and in better condition than his, but still they generate excitement together, and each of them makes more sense. Here's a couple that's never been separated. This is a shipbuilder in the act of evidently drawing a ship's hull, one of those fast and roomy merchant vessels that carried much of the Dutch overseas trade. But the drawing's probably for a treatise on ships rather than an actual design to be built. In any case, his wife reaches out, holding the door handle as she's got, see her hand up here, she's got a grip on the door handle as she makes her delivery, and opens her mouth as if to speak to him. This is a new and different kind of portrait of a marriage. This is an active partnership, a couple engaged with each other, and the wife creating the action. When I was a student, we had no idea who these people were. But soon after, the Amsterdam archivist Isa van Egen managed to identify them in the archives. They were the very successful master shipbuilder Jan Rijksen and his wife Grietje Jans. Both were early investors in the Dutch East India Company. This was a good thing to do. Think Microsoft. The people who paid the highest taxes of anybody living in the shipyard district where other rich people lived. There's been another recent development with this picture. A 19th century engraving has been published that tells us something important about how the picture once looked. It was taller and more spacious. An analysis of the canvas has confirmed that it had indeed been cut down. By whom and why, we don't know. And the space is now a lot more compressed around the figures than Rembrandt intended. Before and after his marriage to Rembrandt, Saskia Uilenburg served as a model for him. She did that fairly often. Here are two pictures of her in fancy dress, on the right with a big hat and a feather and a coquettish smile, not intended as a portrait, but again is what contemporaries called a tronie, intended for the market, probably via the family dealer Uilenburg. And on the left, she's dressed in gorgeous Arcadian or shepherdess outfit with a staff holding a mass of flowers. She probably represents Flora, the goddess of gardens. Like the shipbuilder portrait, this composition underwent some major changes long after it left the studio. X-rays have revealed a welter of form on the lower right that doesn't match what we see on the surface. It was obviously painted over at some early stage of the design. If you look hard at it, you can see that at the level of Flora's shoulder here, There's a head in profile, and below that a kind of scoop of drapery. Researchers in London showed that Rembrandt's gentle Flora began life as the Israelite heroine Judith, who seduced the invading Babylonian general Holofernes, got him drunk, and cut his head off. She's often pictured doing just that, or else handing off the head to her maidservant, which is what you see in Rubens's painting at the bottom. You can verify the fact that Rembrandt was thinking about this subject by looking at the drawing on the top here, which includes the bed with the headless corpse, and the bed and the maid on the floor stuffing the head into the bag. This is quite a change. She first held a sword in her right hand, which Rembrandt painted out and replaced with this staff with ivy wound around it. The head and the maid are gone, but her expression didn't change at all. The calm killer, Judith, becomes the fertile Flora without moving a muscle. We have no idea why Rembrandt made the change. It's easy to imagine a client in the studio, though, seeing the Judith and the head and asking for something, well, more pleasant. Earlier I mentioned Rembrandt's admirer, Constantijn Huygens, and his boss, Rembrandt's admirer, Constantijn Huygens. I mentioned the admirer, Constantijn Huygens, and his boss, Frederick Henry, Prince of Orange, and the fact that by the age of 25, the artist had sold several small history paintings to the prince, including this one. Just a few years later came a bigger commission for 2 paintings of scenes from the life of Christ. What seems to have prompted the commission was this painting by Rembrandt that was discovered and published while I was a student, A Christ on the Cross, in an unexpected place, the parish church near a town in a town near Bordeaux, a picture signed and dated 1631. It's a stark image of an isolated victim crying out to God at the 9th hour, "Why have you forsaken me?" Both Rembrandt and his old studio mate and competitor, Jan Lievens, painted the same subject in the same year in a similar round-topped format. Since Huygens admired both artists, it's very possible he asked each of them to compete, to paint this subject so he could compare them. There's a drawing by Rembrandt that may record this. It shows an artist with the features of Lievens pondering a picture on the easel whose round-top shape is like the ones that he and Rembrandt had been painting. Well, the next thing we know is that Rembrandt got a commission to paint 2 scenes of the Passion, which led to a total of 7 paintings in the end, 7 paintings of the life of Christ in the same round-top format, each about 3 feet high, a project that took him 7 years. Before we leave these pictures, I want to show you how much both Rembrandt and Lievens owed to Rubens, whose isolated Christ crying out is the prototype. They might have seen this very painting by Rubens, that's a recent acquisition by the Van Otterloos, and is hanging upstairs. In any case, they certainly knew the engraving after it. We expect Catholic patrons like Rubens's to commission paintings of the Passion for chapels or at home for devotional purposes. That's normal, but not so often Calvinists like Huygens and Prince Frederick Hendrik and Rembrandt, whom we expect or assume would be regarding such things as tinged with idolatry. So, the Prince's Passion series comes as a surprise. The first picture was the raising of the cross, which Rembrandt set in near darkness. You can pick out a mass of mostly faceless men pulling and shoving the cross up, watched by apostles at the left and the centurion on horseback, who looks out of the picture as if commanding us to watch justice being done. The light falls on just a few figures, mainly on Christ and on a fashionably dressed young helper who has the features of none other than Rembrandt himself. The artist presents himself as an actual participant, a sinner who bears responsibility for what's happening. We'll come back to that idea in a lecture on the self-portraits. We assumed for a long time that to paint this subject, Rembrandt must have turned to Rubens, to his famous altarpiece in Antwerp, but there's no evidence that's turned up that he ever saw that altarpiece, and it wasn't engraved, and besides, it's very different. It's day-lit, it's swarming with muscle men, and Christ is a beautifully posed, idealized, athletic figure. A better idea was proposed some time ago, that this small woodcut by the German artist Albrecht Altdorfer suggested a much simpler composition to Rembrandt. Like all great artists, Rembrandt was never too proud to borrow, and he often turned to Renaissance printmakers for ideas, to Dürer, Lucas van Leyden, and many others. Rembrandt made a preliminary chalk drawing that was more obviously inspired by Altdorfer's composition. Well, the second picture he delivered was this scene of the aftermath, the lowering of Christ from the cross, and Christ's mother collapsed on the ground. Rembrandt imagines the corpse as a kind of misshapen sack, greenish, his features distorted and unmistakably having been tortured to death. This time it is based on Rubens, as transmitted by this engraved copy, but everything that's noble and beautiful in Rubens becomes horrible in Rembrandt's remake of the composition and the figures. And again, Rembrandt puts himself in the picture. It had been suggested that his motive was to play the part of every man, the medieval personification of all sinners. Now I think it's much more credibly proposed that there's been a more particular reason, especially for the educated audience, that this picture was going to have at court. Just a few years earlier, a prominent Calvinist minister published a poem entitled "He Bore Our Sorrows," which describes all Christ's tortures in vivid detail and says, "It was not the Jews, Lord Jesus, who crucified you. It is I, Lord, who have done all this to thee." This seems to be the spirit and the purpose that led Rembrandt to paint himself as one of the executioners in the raising of the cross, and this man receiving the corpse in the descent from the cross. Rembrandt saw this composition as an opportunity to do as Rubens had done, to produce a large print of it, which he did with a great deal of help from an artist he had trained, Jan van Vliet. After this, there were a few more large reproductive etchings, but Rembrandt gave that up and devoted himself to smaller prints by his own hand. That too is going to be the subject of another lecture. The two crucifixion pictures got him a commission for 3 more scenes from the Passion, which took him 6 years. He exchanged letters about this with Huygens, who was evidently not at all pleased. And in one of them, in 1639, Rembrandt offers a celebrated excuse for the delay. "The entombment and resurrection did indeed take a long time," he said, "but the result was that in these 2 pictures the greatest and most natural emotion and animation have been observed, which is also the principal reason why they've been so long in the making." In the translation I just read to you, Rembrandt was striving for, the translation says, emotion and animation. The words Rembrandt used was bewegelijkheid, which you see there in italics, or movement. Dutch scholars have argued for years over what that meant. Movement, is that literally physical action, or is movement in the sense of being moved by what you see? The consensus now, I think, would be that Rembrandt was adopting an idea from classical rhetoric. The function of rhetoric was to persuade the reader, or the listener, by using an appeal to strong emotions. In other words, by moving the listener. Rembrandt's ability to depict emotions and arouse them in the viewer is just what Huygens had praised so lavishly 6 or 7 years later. Nevertheless, these paintings seem to have been difficult for him, in part maybe because of their small size, which he probably felt confining. He'd certainly wanted to prove himself with bigger things, as Rubens had. And so, what followed in 1639, after he'd finished the series, but hadn't yet been paid for the last delivery, was a curious episode. He wrote this to Huygens: "As my lord has been troubled in these matters for a second time, a piece 10 feet wide and 8 feet high will be presented to my lord at his home." When Huygens learned that, and when Rembrandt learned that Huygens had doubts about accepting the gift, he wrote again. He said, "Against my lord's wish," this is Rembrandt writing again, "against my lord's wish, I'm sending this accompanying canvas, hoping that you will not decline this." He also requests that he get paid right away for the last 2 Passion pictures. And Rembrandt adds the only other observation about his art that survives. "My lord," he wrote, "hang this piece in a strong light so that one can stand at a distance, and then it will sparkle best." The picture was almost certainly this one, The Blinding of Samson, definitely a piece to stand at a distance from. Not that Huygens ever did. He seems to have stuck by his refusal to accept it. In Rembrandt's staging, Delilah's trick has worked. She has seduced the Israelite strongman. She's learned that his strength is in his hair, and she's removed some. She flees with it as the soldiers slam him to the ground and put out his eyes. It's as graphically violent as the descent from the cross, and painted with a forceful design and great breadth, the way Rubens did. Rembrandt had to have seen himself in a contest here. Rubens's version of the subject at the bottom looks positively polite by comparison. He chooses the moment of the haircut before it ignites the action. At the right, Rubens's most horrific victim, upside down. This is Prometheus, upside down and having his liver eaten by an eagle. Even Prometheus has a kind of elegance in his pose. That's the opposite of Rembrandt's ungainly Samson, helpless on the ground. Well, here's a realistic detail to turn your stomach. The spurt of blood from Samson's eye and the dagger being used to produce it, and not even a normal European weapon, but a wavy-bladed Southeast Asian dagger called a kris, which seems somehow even worse. With this, I want to end. Thank you. In the next lecture, I'm going to pick up the thread and talk about what made Rembrandt such a brilliant success in Amsterdam. This was not just portraits, but above all, it was his ability to choose important events from the Bible, from history, from the myth, and visualize them in an original and powerful and memorable form. We'll look closely at this painting of the sacrifice of Isaac and many others besides. So please come back. Thank you.